Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Chainlink, for this awesome conference. And I am so excited for this panel. It should be so interesting. If you love it, hit it free, the realities of decentralized power transfer. And it really kind of captures the essence of the moment in DeFi that we're living, this push towards greater decentralization. And we have the leaders of two of some of the best examples of this. So Robert Leshner, the founder of Compound Finance, and Kain Warwick, the founder of Synthetix. Thanks so much.
Hey, Cami. Thanks.
Thanks, Camila. Excited to be here.
Okay, and I'm the founder of the Defiant, a content platform focusing on decentralized finance. Hopefully you are all subscribed to our newsletter and the YouTube channel. I should also say we are all members of White Hair Avatar Group, though you're a bit cooler. I mean, you're crypto funds. I'm World of Women, which is also pretty cool.
Nice.
But I just noticed that fact. So this is super interesting. So as a brief intro, Synthetix Foundation dissolved itself a year ago, handing over control to 3 DAOs, and likewise Compound tokenized governance last year, replacing the administrator of Compound Protocol and leaving its decision-making process to its community of token holders. This was a long process. It took a couple of years for both protocols. So we will be discussing why this decision was made, what the steps were to get there, and how's it going so far. First, though, because this is a Chainlink conference, I'll start with a nod to our host. So can we start off just by each of you talking about how you use Chainlink in your own protocols?
Sure. Yeah, I can go first. So, one of the biggest points of centralization in the early Synthetix system was our proprietary Oracle that was being run by the Synthetix Foundation. And, even before we got to the point where we were ready to dissolve the foundation, we knew that we needed to get that sort of central, failure point away from the foundation and out into some other process. And so, we looked around and thankfully, some smart people and the guys from Framework connected us, with Chainlink. We'd been kind of talking to them for a while, and we were like, okay, this is it. Like, we're ready to do this. We sat down, we talked to Sergey, and we talked to a bunch of the people on the team, and we were like, this is the path forward for us. And we were one of the first groups to kind of implement the Chainlink oracles, which was a huge step forward for us. Because at the time, this was something that we were basically maintaining, constantly, right? And so, I think, I think we were able to get away from that very centralized component that we had, and that was something that was a big step in removing the need for foundation that had to run all this infrastructure and had to have servers and uptime and all that kind of stuff.
Very cool. How about for Compound?
Well, for Compound, this is actually going to dovetail with the theme of the conversation, which is governance. So Compound uses Chainlink for our price feeds. And this is actually a process that unfolded through community governance for us, which is really exciting. So, like Kain mentioned, this is something that started off entirely centralized. And for Compound, it went through really 3 stages. One was an entirely centralized price feed. The second was an open price feed, which the community could decide what the price inputs would be. And the third was, the community choosing to use Chainlink as the primary input into the pricing system. And so for us, we're as a community now using the Chainlink price feed. And this was a process that unfolded through the decentralization process.
Very cool. Okay, so yes, that does dovetail nicely. So back to the topic of decentralized governance. How did you come to the decision of giving up governance to token holders? Was this a plan for the start, or did you come to the realization that this was kind of the way to go as you were building your protocol? And yeah, maybe Kain, you can start again.
Yeah, so I think at the start of our project, there were a lot of people that were very skeptical about the approach that we took, which was to have this sort of rapid iteration. We had these proxy contracts that had a lot of control over the protocol. We could iteratively update the contracts and did so quite regularly. And there was rightly a lot of skepticism around that because there was a question of, well, who is doing this, right? There's this software foundation that has all of this control. There was not the same level of sort of decentralization as you had in something like Ethereum, where there are multiple parties that were participating in this process. It was really just a software foundation that was kind of rolling out changes to the contracts, and there wasn't a lot of oversight in how that could happen. But we said from the beginning, there will be oversight. We will hand it over to the community. Token holders will take control, and the skeptics obviously were rightly had some questions at the time, but I think over time, we've kind of been able to demonstrate that was genuinely our intent. We intended to do that from the beginning. We've kind of adhered to that. And I think in reality, where we've gone to now is far beyond what I think we contemplated at the beginning. We had an idea of something that would have some aspect of token holder control or whatever. The current Synthetix governance framework is probably far more decentralized than I could have imagined back then when we were talking about giving some control to token holders in this process.
So interesting. So were you initially thinking that you or the team would retain some level of control and some parts of the organization would be open to token holder governance, but in the end, what ended up happening is that everything is now up to token holders?
Yeah, exactly right. We thought that there would be some kind of like checks on power in terms of like token holders being able to like prevent certain things from happening, or like stage gates needed to kind of process things. But in fact, it's actually gone much further than that. So, we have a representative democracy. We've got a council, which is voted in by token holders. They make decisions on changes to the protocol. There's very little that obviously the foundation's been even dissolved, right? So that component no longer exists at all. But there was a sense that there would be like some level of power kind of retained from the core contributors, the people that were building the protocol. And in fact, there probably remains a little bit of control, but it's far less control than I think we anticipated at the beginning when we started this process. The token holders really do drive most of the activity in the network now. Obviously, there's people implementing the changes, but other than that implementation component, it's 100% controlled by token holders.
Got it. Super interesting. How about for Compound? Like, was this type of governance always a plan?
To build a financial market that would run for 100 years. And you can't have a centralized entity controlling something that's going to run for 100 years. I mean, most corporations on earth, even the biggest ones, are not 100 years old. And our analogy that we always used internally was that if Bitcoin were run by the Bitcoin Corporation, it would be worth zero. And so the goal was always to create an anti-fragile system that would outlast any member of our team. And so to get there, it was essentially mandatory that we would find ways to decentralize. It's the ability to remove human error. It's the ability to, remove, sovereign state level interventions. It's the ability to build a system that developers and applications can rely on, that it's going to be there, not just next week or next month, but like next decade. And so, we always knew that decentralization was mandatory. It was more a question about how to get there, when to get there, and what the steps would be, because there was never really a playbook that we were able to just take off the shelf to follow. We had to write the playbook. And now a lot of teams in DeFi can follow it, which is one of the greatest things we've done. And so, from Compound's perspective, we had to learn a lot of things in real time. We were able to observe some of the best practices and worst practices of other teams that were a little bit ahead of us in the process. We learned a lot from MakerDAO. We learned a lot from Synthetix. We learned a lot just from different experiments happening in crypto. But for us, we had to essentially design, a process of handing over control of the protocol to the community. And that became the Compound governance system. It's, I think a best-in-class system for voting on code changes to a protocol without any intermediaries. One of the failures we had seen elsewhere was, needing like a foundation or a middleman to even put things up to a vote. We wanted to design a system that was, completely open to improvement. And so this became the Compound governance system. At this point, a lot of other teams are able to use the governance contracts. We're seeing Compound governance and the time lock and the voting style and the token itself being used everywhere. Open Zeppelin is using it as a standard library at this point. And this is, the end result of it is now there's almost a generic governance system that we were able to create that others can benefit from as well.
Very cool. Yeah. White labeling governance.
Yeah.
It's a great point because both Compound and Synthetix are, some of the earliest DeFi protocols. So you really did have to write the playbook on governance. You didn't have much earlier kind of examples or kind of rules to follow. So what elements and structures did had to be in place for your protocols to get to where you felt comfortable delegating governance? I'll
go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll take the pressure off of Kain. So the most important thing for Compound was knowing that if we were going to hand over control to the community, the protocol had to be in a state in which it was operating with stability, that there wouldn't be a bug discovered overnight. That a community would have to respond to. What we wanted to do was have enough of a Lindy effect, knowing that if we handed over control, the community wouldn't likely have to respond overnight to any issues that would arrive, that any issues could be solved during a 1 week governance process, knowing that the Compound governance system is relatively slow by design. And so we had to essentially wait, at least a year from our last major code changes before rolling out governance. So really it was a lot of hurry up and wait and do nothing in order for it to be stable enough that we felt confident allowing the community to be the ones managing the protocol.
Okay, so basically making sure that the code was sound, that there were no major bugs there.
That's right, because one of the biggest trade-offs of governance versus centralization is in centralization, you have the ability to respond and move extremely quickly. In decentralization, you lose some of that. And I think over time, the communities are going to figure out how to be able to move extremely quickly with decentralized governance and control. But right now, it's more of a trade-off. And so, before we moved over to decentralization and community control, we had to put it in a position where they wouldn't, have to, face as many technical risks.
Makes sense. How about something about the community itself? Were there any signs that you were waiting for to see whether the users or the community was strong enough to handle that level of responsibility?
Well, we tried to ease the community into it. So one of the things that Compound did, which was relatively novel, which we actually haven't seen replicated elsewhere, but I think is a pretty useful model, is we essentially had an alpha test of public governance before we rolled it out to the entire community. So there was a 3-month period prior to the comp token being distributed to users where we tested voting on the protocol with a number of stakeholders, with prominent members of the community. It was almost like a Compound council in a way, like the Synthetix council, but it was we found 20 or 30 people that were participating in running the protocol. And it was an intermediary step from, a single team to the full community. And we were able to test a lot of the proposal process and governance tools and ensure that everything was starting to run smoothly and that enough stakeholders knew how to enact changes that, once we rolled it out to a broader audience, there would start to be a muscle memory.
Cool. Okay. So making sure that there are no major bugs, running tests with a smaller group of users, and making sure like all the tools worked and people knew how, like what they had to do. How about for Synthetix?
To go back to an earlier point that Robert made, which I think is pretty interesting. The fact that there was very little in terms of governance out there, in terms of governance frameworks. Probably Maker was one of the few examples. There were some non-Ethereum examples that I think had gone even less well, but like Maker was like one of the few things that was like out there, right? I think the fact that there was so little in the way of a playbook or off-the-shelf components that you could use, and everyone had to kind of build their own thing, is one of the reasons why, if you look at the kind of older DeFi projects, their governance is so different. Like Compound governance and Synthetix governance, I think are quite different. It would have been amazing to me if the Compound governance model, was there, right, as a piece of software that we could have used when Synthetix started to, decentralize. We probably would have used it as well, I think, right, or use some component of it. But in fact, we were kind of building in parallel these separate systems, and the same goes for a number of other projects. So it is just quite interesting, I think, that today, as a project, you can kind of come and cherry pick little bits and pieces, and it's a much easier process. And we are definitely converging on something that makes sense. Obviously, there's always going to be trade-offs with different projects and what they're optimizing for. But I do think that most of us would have had a much more similar governance structure if we'd had the ability to kind of work collaboratively, through that process. But in terms of how Synthetix governance played out, we, have always had this view of small iterative experiments. So we started off with like letting people, make really small decisions in Discord that were kind of inconsequential, right? Like, it was very trivial things, not even like parameter changes, just like things about, what we were all going to do or whatever. And we slowly added to that and handed more power over. And as we did that, we needed to work out new mechanisms for handing that, who was that power going to be handed to? How were they going to exercise that power? And so we slowly built out all the different little tools and things, and pulled some off the shelf, like Snapshot, for example, we used, and obviously Gnosis Safe, and a number of other components. But it was definitely a process that was iterative rather than us saying, okay, in a year's time, this is where we need to be. And, we're going to really think about like, what is that place and where do we want to be and go and build it. The fact that Compound was able to do that is kind of insane to me, right? Because like I make fun of projects all the time for trying to do that and failing miserably. And like the balance of probability says like Compound should not have been able to pull that off. And somehow they did. So it's a pretty impressive feat in my mind.
Thanks, Kain.
I was on mute. Okay. Interested in the point you made about how different current governance models are to Synthetix and Compound's earlier ones. Where would you say kind of the new wave of like governance is going?
I mean, we are iterating closer to Compound, basically, right? Like we're iterating towards that where, we're getting to a point that a change is encoded in a contract, the contract is deployed, and then there is some sort of governance process that kind of ratifies that change, and then it's implemented on chain, right? Like it's a much more secure and safe way of kind of implementing changes. It's slower and it has trade-offs, but in terms of not needing to sort of cede power to some group of people that are administering a multi-sig that's making the changes and making a decision about which contracts are connected to, to what services or whatever, it's much, much safer because everyone can see it. It's transparent. You deploy the contract, you look at it, we all agree that is the contract, that's the change, and then we vote on just that specific thing. Again, direct democracy versus a representative democracy versus like some form of delegation, like there's flavors and nuances there. And I think we've gone much more towards like a very, representative democracy rather than like a delegated democracy. But in terms of how we actually get the changes on chain, we're much closer to Compound now and we're moving closer. We think it's a much better model.
Okay, because right now, and this kind of goes into the next question I wanted to ask, which is just getting into more details on how each of your governance models actually work. So for Synthetix, is it that the final change is made via a multisig? Is that still the case?
Yep,
okay.
It's still the case. Yeah.
Right. And so what you're saying is that you want that model to transition into something that is made kind of more on-chain?
Exactly. And our last 2 upgrades actually were done this way. It was still done by the protocol DAO, the multisig, but effectively there was a contract that was deployed. Everyone was able to review it before protocol DAO, implemented the change. But in the future, it should be possible for us to effectively have someone deploy that contract as part of the SIP, the Synthetix Improvement Proposal process, and say, okay, this is the contract change. It's on chain now. You can inspect it. And then the council turns up and says, okay, we've inspected that change. We're comfortable with it. And then they vote on it. And then, it's implemented, rather than having some intermediary. And so I think that's the thing that Compound really got right. And I think it's a powerful approach and removes a lot of the kind of centralization and other risks that we have in other projects where there is a multi-sig that's implementing changes.
Wow, that's so interesting. So what will be the process for Synthetix to make that change? I imagine it has to go through another governance vote.
Interestingly, kind of, right? The change will have to be to give power to the Spartan Council to be able to execute a contract. So effectively what will need to happen is that right now there's a multisig. That multisig will need to transition to the Spartan Council, and they will have, at the moment, they have NFTs, which give them the power to vote. Those NFTs will give them the power to actually execute a transaction on chain. That will be kind of the next phase.
Oh, but okay. Wouldn't that just switch one centralized body to another one? What's the difference between a multisig and the Spartan Council?
Yeah, so the Spartan Council is voted in by people, and there are fairly strong checks on power within the Spartan Council. So token holders basically vote for a council member, but they also have the ability to remove, to withdraw their voting power, right? And we've seen this happen a couple of times. So, for example, if I voted for you, you're on the council, and you do something which I believe is against my interest, I can actually, on that one specific thing, pull my voting power away from you, which dilutes your ability to vote. And so if let's say there was a contract that was, highly contentious that was deployed, and the Spartan Council votes on it, and multiple people within the community are concerned about it, they would be able to withdraw their voting power, and that process would not be able to be executed. Whereas at the moment, the protocol DAO can just execute it. There's no check on their power. There's no way to stop them from executing something. They can just do it today with no oversight, really. The only oversight is that they've got some level of alignment because they're token holders, they've got a bond, there's some slashing, there's some other things, but it's nowhere near as powerful as having some direct execution mechanism like you have in the compound governance model.
Okay, that's interesting. And how many people are in the council?
There's 8 currently.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting. And okay, so for Compound, how does it feel like being kind of the gold standard of governance? That's pretty cool.
It's cool, but I think the best part about it is that we've built a process that I think is the safest and the most transparent and the most reusable by other teams. And I think the most gratifying part is actually seeing other teams getting to use the same code and not having to reinvent the wheel. A great example is I think the Synthetix staking contract and the Compound time lock are probably the most recycled contracts in DeFi. The best part is not that we got to use it, is that everyone got to use it. Because that's what moves the space as a whole forward the most, is being able to have a multiplicative power effect. And the system itself is actually extremely simple. I'll just describe it. There's basically a 2-day review period for a code change. There's a 3-day voting period for the code change, and a 2-day waiting period before it goes into effect if it's passed. And you're voting on very specific parameter changes or contract changes that are all executable code. So there's never like instructions for a foundation, change the logo on the website or please go out and do X, Y, or Z. It's like the code has to be written ahead of time and then it gets voted on. So it's like a very methodical process that requires you to have essentially completed all of the work. Ideally had it, reviewed by the community and by peers. And it's a system that's, coupled with the fact that anybody can bring code changes. They don't have to get the sign off or approval of a multisig or somebody first. And so this has actually enabled some really cool things. It enables the community to sort of create their own proposals. A great example is there's members of the community who work with Chainlink to add new assets to the price feed. That's a beautiful thing to watch. And you get to see, the whole system evolving and upgrading without, needing anyone's permission or sign off first. And so, if people have ideas that, they want to use a new, price feed or a new resource or a new, Chainlink, verifiable randomness function or a proof of, reserves of wrapped Bitcoin or some other feature, the community can actually, put forth proposals to implement new features. And so, it's a disciplined process combined with, it being open and permissionless that I think is really, really strong.
Very cool. And then for the more superficial, if you can call them that, changes a logo on a website, that all of those changes go, there are, I guess, specific teams dedicated to all the other stuff that doesn't pertain to parameters in the protocol, right?
Exactly. It's governance just over the protocol itself. So there's other off-chain components that aren't governed by the comp token. So, the website is still run by Compound Labs. The goal is to completely open source everything and let the community run it. And we'll just point to the best IPFS hash. And we're almost at that final step where, we've handed over complete control of the protocol itself. And now there's some things that we're still building or working on that haven't been fully turned over yet. But the goal is to get to the point where, even the website itself is run and owned by the community, and it might not go through the governance system, which is, it's on Ethereum, it's Solidity based, you're not, voting on code changes to a website, but if the community just, wants to maintain it on their own or run it on their own, they have that ability to.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's been over a year for both of your protocols since you yielded control. What are the lessons so far? I know it's a hard one.
There's been lessons. So I think one of the lessons that we've learned is building an engaged community is invaluable, right? And Synthetix, I think, has had that for a very long time. We've had one of the most engaged communities in crypto. We've got one of the best discords in crypto. If you don't have that, I think it would be a far harder task to kind of hand this control over, because who are you handing it over to? What are their incentives? Is the incentive alignment there? So I think before you can even contemplate handing over control, you need to have an engaged and aware community, right? You need to do that community building, which is then, an interesting question of, once you've done that and you've built this community and you've started to hand over power, where does the break point kind of sit between, for example, in Synthetix, we have core contributors who are paid full-time to work on the protocol. They're paid by the DAO. So they're essentially paid by token holders to do that, but they have a purpose within the protocol. And one of the things that I think has come up for us this year is me having stepped back from kind of running the core contributors and helping to kind of dictate strategy and all kind of, a number of other aspects, that there are certain things that the community is probably not yet ready to take over. And certain functions that, either were not handed over well, or just maybe are hard to hand over. There might be some things that the community just can't do, right? And you actually need to appoint certain people to certain roles and ensure that those people are kind of maintaining those roles, right? So that's definitely something that I think that Synthetix has been dealing with. And one of the reasons why I came back and ran for the SmartCon Council was to deal with some of the, the inefficiencies and friction that we've sort of seen in this process. But like everything Synthetix, it's iterative, right? Like we try something, I step back, things catch on fire, I come back, I put out the fires, and hopefully next time we're in a better place so the fires don't start, right? Like that's kind of the process that we're going through.
Nice. Kain, I love how you're kind of like just like so open about what's going on. It's really
yeah.
Okay, so
yeah.
So what are like those roles that you think are harder for a community to initially take on?
Most projects have a leader, right? Or like some figurehead or some person that like, both the community and the broader crypto community sort of associate, right, with that project, right? Maker, it's Rune, right? Like if someone asks, like, I don't know if Maker is still run by Rune. Like, I don't know how much day-to-day control he has, but if you ask me, like, who is the person that I would look to be like, what is the purpose of Maker? It's Rune. I'm just gonna look there, right? And it's Hayden with Uniswap. It's obviously Robert with Compound. But there's a big difference between being kind of the face of a protocol and controlling it, right? And being the dictator. That's, I think, the thing that all of us are kind of trying to work out in real time, right? Because we've never had a situation where, like Travis Kalanick just goes, hey, like I'm handing over control of Uber to the Uber drivers now. And like, see you later, like, and just what, like, no, like, that's not a thing, right? Like, like there's a CEO and that CEO runs the company, and there's no ambiguity there. Like there's zero ambiguity about like who is running, obviously there's a board and there's corporate oversight and all kinds of corporate governance stuff, but realistically, the CEO of a company runs the company. Everyone knows it. They're both the figurehead, the public facing person, and also the person who ultimately controls what happens, right? And when you remove that and you hand over control to this diffuse group of people, how do you ensure that, I think people do need to kind of have some anchor point or some person or whatever. And who is that? Now we've seen in the cases, things like Yearn, right? Projects like Yearn, I think have done a really good job where some community member has stepped up, like Banteg has stepped up, and people are now, well, it's him, them, a non-person, right? Rather than say Andre. Right. Like, and so like there are some examples of this going well, but it's a really hard process. And, I'm very curious to see how like even Robert thinks about this, because at some point, like Robert doesn't control Compound in the way that he did 2 years ago. Right. At what point do I stop caring what Robert thinks? Like, do I always have to care about what Robert, like I care about, his CryptoPunk views, right? But like, at what point do I stop listening to Robert about Compound? I don't know. Like maybe I always have to listen to him. Like we really genuinely don't know how these things play out over longer time horizons.
Such an interesting discussion. I mean, Robert, what's your take there about project leadership and what place does it have in a decentralized world?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think you're always going to have spiritual cheerleaders for a project, right? Myself included. Kain, like everybody. Like if you founded something, even if you in a distant future don't have any financial stake in it, like you're still a big part of it. Like a great example is like Steve Jobs founded Apple and like only held on to a single share of Apple, right? But like still everyone knew that like Steve Jobs is someone that like was important, within the Apple construct, even if he had like no control at all over, what they did or how it worked. And so I think like over time, the founders of protocols become less important. Satoshi matters a lot less to Bitcoin today than he did, 10 years ago, he or she, right? And I think it's always a declining, path for the most part. But, I do think that like there is some relevance and it will decline. And I think that's a good thing, right? I think like it doesn't matter. Like no one 100 years later really remembers who founded, Ford and what he was like. They just know that there was a Henry Ford, and I think that protocols will be the same way, that in 100 years, people will be like, oh yeah, Synthetix. Yeah, that awesome protocol that took over, all synthetic and derivative assets. There was this guy named Kain, but who knows what he was like, and I think that's a really positive thing.
That's cool. I think maybe the job of the leader is to make sure that some kind of high level goal and vision is instilled very deeply in all of the contributors, team members, and people kind of bringing the company organization forward, so that that's kind of is what's passed on, and it doesn't matter. He can kind of still, they can be the face, but maybe it's the rest of the community kind of executing the vision that they set out to build. Okay, so this was a bit of a tangent, but a really interesting one. But back to the original question, Robert, I'm interested in your lessons from compound governance so far.
Yeah, I think the biggest lessons from compound governance so far is that, we designed a system that was, deliberately going to be a relatively slow process, because the value that we were trying to maximize was stability. When we talked about what we wanted when we were designing all of this, we wanted, a system that wouldn't change every day. And I think we got that. I think it's possible that, we vaguely overcorrected in, this stability, because, it's also a system that I sort of wish in retrospect would be a little bit more experimental. I think Synthetix is a, great example of a community that's always been extremely experimental, trying all sorts of things, all the time, seeing what works, throwing out the things that don't work, and adjusting and calibrating. And the compound, community governance process isn't as experimental. So if there's one thing I would change, going back, it might be setting the initial parameters of governance, even for how long do you have to vote on things, to sort of infuse a little bit more experimental DNA into the process. But other than that, things have held up extremely well. Over the past year, we've seen a rate of governance proposals in which the majority have come directly from the community, which was really cool to see. I didn't expect there's going to be such a high ratio of proposals coming just directly from, developers, interested community members, VCs, alongside us. And so that's been a strong positive. And there's been about one proposal a week, on average, since compound governance has launched. And so I've been impressed with the fact that just it's been, generally not us, as Compound Labs, driving any of these proposals forward.
It's funny, actually. I remember in the early days, first couple of proposals or whatever, I was barriers to entry are too high here. No one's going to do this. And you're no, people they're working it out. And I was I'm very skeptical of how many people are going to go through the trouble of understanding how to write a contract that conforms to this thing. And I'm glad that I was wrong, but I do remember that conversation that we had, and you're no, it'll work. So
yeah. Well, that was a big experiment, just from us. We had to come up with a hypothesis and put it into motion and see if it works. And governance is a huge experiment that takes years to play out. I actually think, one of the best governance communities is Maker. It has its own warts, but in general, they've done a great job building a governance community, and that's taken years, right? And Synthetix has developed over years. It's also a great, community. So I actually think, the end state of what a governance system in a community looks like is measured maybe at the 3-year mark, not the 3-week mark of it going live.
Really? And when you mean governance community, it's the people making the proposals, writing the changes, executing this.
Yeah, it's everybody involved in moving a protocol forward.
Yeah, I wonder one thing about on-chain governance proposals and having something that's kind of very, very specific. It seems it just limits the amount of people who can participate because it is so technical. I wonder if the governance, tokenized governance, will evolve into a place where there are different roles, and maybe there's a role where there's just like a technical advisor who can kind of write proposals from non-technical members into code. I think maybe those kinds of new professions will start to emerge in Web3. I don't know. I'd like to see that from kind of someone who's not non-technical.
Absolutely. I mean, I think like, I think of like any corporation that exists today, like one day there might be like a decentralized version of it. Like, so, I use like Nike as an example. It's like, well, if Nike were like, a token run corporation, what would it look like? You wouldn't have everybody designing shoes, in the community. You might have some like ideas that come forth, but you probably wouldn't have people volunteering to do like material science. You'd probably have a couple experts, managing the material process. You probably wouldn't want, every customer to be weighing in on certain issues. And over time, you would specialize and figure out ways to specialize as a large decentralized community. So, I think like everyone votes on everything is probably, naive. And I think communities that succeed will figure out ways to move with like this open democratic foundation and build out specialized skills and tools and, experiences.
Right. And that kind of leads well into the next question, which is, I wanted to bring up this, I guess like one of the biggest criticisms with tokenized governance, which is that it creates this sort of a plutocracy where big token holders, project members with the most at stake in protocols have the biggest say. So I wanted your thoughts. Like, do you think this is an issue that needs to be fixed, or do you think that it's fair that large stakeholders have the biggest say in the protocols they're investing in?
Well, I'll start by saying that, you have the exact same behavior in every, public corporation in the world, where whoever has the most shares, gets to have the most control over the corporation, right? There's obviously, counterexamples where like some tech companies have founders that retain huge amounts of effective control through like dual class, like voting structures. But like in general, this is like the form of, corporate and, protocol governance that is in effect pretty much everywhere, where the more you own, the more say you have. And I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing, because I also think it means that you have like the largest stakeholders motivated to see it succeed the most. The biggest disconnect will occur when you have the largest owners who put in the least amount of effort. I think that's something that's like a point of friction for decentralized communities, where people want to see the most ownership translate to the most effort. And, I think we'll see lots of different, conversations in crypto over the next couple of years with these sort of like friction points. But I don't think, the correlation between having largest stake and the largest say is a problem. And I think it's actually okay. And it's not something to combat.
I think this is one area where we definitely disagree. I think Compound is not in like by far not like problematic in this area, because I think the delegated component of Compound allows for people who maybe feel less confident in their ability to judge protocol changes to delegate to someone who they feel is going to vote similarly to how they would like to vote and kind of respect their views. But there is definitely a plutocratic element to it, right? Like there's no question, right? Particularly when it comes to, there's like a social plutocracy as well, right? Where like high profile people or VCs or whatever get a lot of delegation. And so there is a lot of control in a small number of hands in Compound. Now, I think the fact that Compound has constrained what is governable means that's not so much of an issue, right? Like it's real, like most of these things are fairly binary decisions, right? Like, is this risky or not risky, right? And so I think in most cases there is like general alignment in the protocol, but Synthetix has gone a very different way, and I think Synthetix has made a decision, not even intentionally, although we definitely never liked this idea of direct token voting. We did. There's always been a sort of social norm within Synthetix that like direct token voting, like Maker, just has like chilling effects and all kinds of problems that, cause people to drop out who might be like minority stakeholders and have different views. And so the fact that we didn't have an on-chain governance module for such a long time, like Compound did, although we may have used the Compound governance module had it existed, right? So maybe I'm glad that it actually didn't exist back then. But the fact that we had off-chain voting and this like rough consensus process that played out in Discord for a really long time, when we went to kind of make that more on-chain, the initial parameters that were chosen, the minority revolted. Like we chose a structure that actually was much more plutocratic, and the minority said, whoa, we're not okay with this. Like we had a lot more power in the old regime, and we don't want you to take our power away. And so we then made changes and we iterated and we kind of moved closer to something that would significantly curtail the power of whales. So now the situation is, if you're a whale within Synthetix, there's 8 council members. You can get one person, maybe. Maybe if you split it across a couple of wallets, maybe you can get 2 council members in, right? But you probably can't get 5, right? Which would be what you sort of need. And so what we have is this distribution where, I think in the last epoch, I got 35% of the votes. A lot of people just defaulted to like, sure, let this guy run the place again, fine. But then there's a long tail distribution of votes that happen. And you end up in a situation where, the marginal voter can really move the dial on like the 6th, 7th, and 8th seats, right? They do have a lot more power. And I think in general, that's allowed us to have something that kind of is a hybrid rough consensus with on-chain component in a way that most other protocols really haven't probably gotten right. I think there's a few protocols that have just gone to like a multi-sig, and the multi-sig people just make the decisions. But I do think that we've somehow just, through a random walk, like found ourselves in this position where we've like struck a balance between, whales and community members, and one person, one vote, and, $1 million worth of voting power, right? Like we've found a middle ground. And I think it's a pretty powerful place that we're in right now.
I agree.
So interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
I was going to say, I think it's awesome. And that like you guys have been able to find that and have been able to conduct like some, social experiments to reach a middle ground. And I think that's like really empowering.
Yeah. I mean, we'll definitely continue seeing so many experiments in this area. Like there's quadratic voting. There's like Gitcoin did this airdrop where like a lot of voting power had to be delegated. I think Pull Together does something to limit the weight that individual token holders can have. So I mean, like, yeah, there's like probably one different governance system. There's as many governance systems as there are protocols. So we will kind of see which good models emerge from this. Interested to hear if there have ever been proposals that have gone against kind of what you wanted for your protocols.
I think I've voted against Robert before, if I remember correctly.
Contentious votes on Compound all the time.
Oh, cool. I think that's a great example of like this actually working. Like, yeah, if you can kind of expand on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the most contentious proposal we've had was around decreasing like the collateral factor for WBTC. It was like a huge asset on Compound. And, I was like extremely against decreasing the collateral factor because it was an incredibly important asset. And a lot of folks in the community wanted to see it decreased because they thought that, Compound was accumulating too much wrapped Bitcoin. Now, the irony is that we have a lot more today than we ever did back then. But, I thought it was going to be a disaster, and users would get liquidated because they wouldn't be paying attention. And it was an extremely contentious vote. I lost, collateral factor was reduced. There was only a couple users that got liquidated. We were able to let the news out and make sure people reduced their borrowing positions, but it was extremely contentious. It was an example of the community like really digging in over like a scientific parameter, which was really cool to witness. But I was definitely on the losing side.
Wow. How about you, Kain?
I mean, there's so many. There's a bunch. I think in the original proposal to change the inflation rate and monetary policy, I was really adamantly against it. We had this crazy Bitcoin halving like cliff thing that I thought was a great idea back in 2018 or whatever when we implemented it. And the community said, like, this is dumb. Like, there's no need to do this. Like, we have the mathematics to like create curves, right? Like, you don't need to have halvings. And so someone went out and they really aggressively like advocated it. And I was like, no, this is dumb. Like, we shouldn't do it. Like, we've changed it once. Like, I still had my Bitcoin maxi hat on back then, I guess, right? I hadn't fully let it go. Yeah, exactly. And they just kept pushing, and eventually got to a point where like there was a vote, and the vote was like very strongly in favor of like, this is a dumb thing, let's change it. And they did. And I was like, all right. But eventually I came around to the point where I was like, all right, actually, like, you are right. But it was a good example of like rough consensus and, building consensus within a community, rather than having some like centralized choke point that, some person that could say, no, we're not doing this, move on, right? Like, let's do, like, a CEO would have said the first time that was brought up in a board meeting or whatever, like, hey guys, I see this problem, like, let's do it. Like, a bad CEO would have just been like, no, shut it down. Right. And then it doesn't happen. Yeah. Right. So it's a much better and more open process when, people can build consensus in the community and override, even strong voices, I guess.
Yeah. And then I guess we need to be wrapping up, but that ties well with the last question I wanted to make, which is, the new model is just so radically different than the old Web 2 model, where founders retain majority stake on their companies, users have no say, and now we're going into Web 3, where like the opposite is happening. Do you foresee like the next Facebook's, Google's, Bank of America's, like just huge global corporations? Will they be DAOs in the future?
No, they're not going to be DAOs in the future. And either they're going to die to the hand of DAOs, or they'll figure out a way to survive, but I don't see them adapting.
Yeah, agreed. I think they'll be wiped out by DAOs, but I don't think they'll turn into DAOs themselves.
So DAOs will be the next big global organizations of the future. I agree with you. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Protocols and DAOs.
Yeah.
Yes. This was amazing, guys. So thank you so much, and thank you, Chainlink, for having us.
Okay, let's go.
Sammy. Yeah.
Thanks, Sammy.
Thank you.
What a great panel. Thank you all so much for coming.